Welcome to Tracy's Terrors. My name is Tracy, and if you love horror and you appreciate smart animal commentary, then you are in the right place. Today, Strigoi, VamPullet, and I are going to be discussing Paul Tremblay's 2024 novel horror movie. I don't know what comes after the postmodern novel. It's been going on at least since the 90s. And if this novel is any indication, then neither does Paul Tremblay. He's still doing the postmodern thing. And in the hands of a talented author like him, that's okay. I think that postmodern techniques still generate interesting insights. In this novel, he foregrounds the artifice of the narrative and plays with the indeterminacy of truth to get readers to consider their own desires. Why do we consume the dark content that we consume? Why are we drawn to it? And even to consider our potential complicity in violence. My only issue is that this interesting exploration of ideas is dependent on this very dark screenplay, the titular horror movie. It's at the center of the novel, and it is like a black abyss where any sense of fun sinks like a stone. Now you might be thinking, if you're looking for fun, why are you reading horror? There are different kinds of horror. I'll talk about this a little bit later. But for me, the depictions of physical and psychological torture that are integral to this screenplay were just so hard to get through that any insights that the book may have offered, any moments of self-revelation about my own desire to consume horror, they just weren't worth the trouble. Having to get through this screenplay was just too much to reach these insights, at least for me. So that's how I want to introduce it. Do we have a summary from either of you? I don't know why I'm asking. I know that that's not your strong suit, so maybe I'll give it a go. So I want to start by giving a brief summary of the novel horror movie. In the novel, our unnamed narrator is the last surviving cast member of Horror Movie, which is a 1993 indie film that was never completed due to a tragedy on set. So since 2008, when the director of Horror Movie released a couple of scenes, a screenplay, some grainy stills, released these things to YouTube, it has gained cult status. So even though this movie was never finished and it was never released, it gains a kind of cult status online, and horror fans like me get on all the social media platforms with their commentary and opinions and conspiracy theories on why the tragedy happened, and examining every aspect of the footage that exists on YouTube. So in order to exploit this popularity and promote a reboot, a new version of Horror Movie, our narrator, who in 1993 played the character of the Thin Kid, is recording an audiobook. And this audiobook is, the text of the novel. And in it, he reflects on the tragedy that happened on set. He talks about the making of the original movie and the reboot, the new project that he's involved in. So interleaved with his memoir is the titular screenplay of Horror Movie. And the story there, it's a story of three teenagers who torture a classmate in an abandoned school until he transforms. That is the story of this original movie, and the screenplay is just kind of woven throughout the book. Every couple of chapters, you'll get sections of it. So it is difficult material that is at the very center of this novel. I struggled with the screenplay that is at the heart of this novel. A large portion of the book, I'd say maybe even half of it, is dedicated to scenes in which the character of the Thin Kid is isolated, humiliated, burned, and maimed. This is not the exaggerated fun of exploding heads and fountains of blood that make you scream or laugh. And this gets to the question of what kind of horror do you like? I'll say for me, I like a supernatural element. There is one here, but it's very, it's very buried. Or a cosmic element, or an exaggerated element to the violence. Cronenbergian kind of gore. That's kind of my bag. It may not be yours. We're all different. But in any case, the violence here is very realistically portrayed. It's just a mundane catalog of cruelty that is wrought with your standard instruments of torture, burning cigarettes, garden shears, that kind of thing. And it didn't leave me, titillated or frightened, and it didn't serve as a point of departure for me to consider larger ideas. It just depressed me. Just humans being awful to each other just kind of isn't my bag. Unfortunately, this violence in the screenplay is interwoven with the chapters, and it is an unavoidable part of the novel's larger project. And there is a larger project here. Okay, so what VamPullet is saying here is very true, although she's using a problematic term. Literary horror, like Tremblay's, doesn't offer gratuitous violence for its own sake. Violence like this is usually, it's in the service of exploring larger ideas. And in this novel, Tremblay is using these depictions of torture to get us to interrogate the desires behind our consumption of this kind of content. Why are we reading about, or, in the case of film, why are we motivated to watch torture? And we're continually prompted to examine ourselves by Cleo. Cleo is a character. She is the author of the screenplay. And she also plays one of the sadistic teens, in the film when they're filming. And she's constantly prompting us to examine ourselves and our own motivation. She does this by filling the script of horror movie, filling this script with what is essentially, reader response theory, which is how do readers feel about what they're reading or respond to it. It's exactly what it sounds like, reader response theory. In this case, it would be film. She's imagining how viewers are going to react to what they see. She projects that filmgoers are going to be excited by the violence that they're seeing, and maybe even a little bit embarrassed at their own barely suppressed bloodlust as they see the thin kid be tortured. And as the brutality escalates, she asserts that viewers, are eventually going to become aware of their own complicity in the violence that they're seeing, and they're going to realize that they too are monsters. Like these teenagers torturing a classmate, they are monsters who are capable of inflicting pain on innocent people. Strigoi wants me to note that a film and a screenplay are very different things. They are different mediums, and they produce their own unique impressions on consumers. Good point, duly noted, Strigoi. That said, Chloe's expectations for the film goer are in no way congruent with my reading of the text. I don't find myself salivating with each fresh injury done to the thin kid, nor do I find myself identifying with his attackers. This might sound incredibly naive of me, but I don't think we're all monsters. And the idea that we are, the idea that deep down inside each one of us is a murderer, has just been done to death in horror. Anyone who has taken a film theory class, or even if you haven't, is familiar with the idea that the cinematic gaze is an instrument of violence. The cinematic gaze is a knife, it is an axe, and the viewer, the filmgoer, is the one wielding it. A la Psycho, a la Peeping Tom, especially. It's an interesting metaphor. It's spawned its own publishing industry, but it's just a metaphor. And the novel's damning equivalence between consumers of horror media and the thin kid's attackers, the teens who torture him, it just doesn't add up for me. But is this equivalence fair if what we're watching or reading is the product of actual suffering? In horror novel, Tremblay considers this more difficult question by doing that very postmodern thing, by collapsing the distinctions between fiction and reality within the world of the book. The film industry has an ugly history of collapsing the distinction between fiction and reality, particularly when it comes to low-budget horror movies with egotistical male directors. in Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is a movie that Cleo in the book really admires. Marilyn Burns didn't have to act like she was being hit, dragged, and cut, because these things were really happening to her on set. Her fear and her pain looked real because they were. And like Tobe Hooper, Valentina, who is the director of Horror Movie, has no budget for special effects or stunt doubles, nor does she have any concern for the safety of her cast. And so she encourages our narrator, the actor who played the thin kid, to go method on that role, to become fully immersed with the character. And he does. And the identification is so complete that inside and outside of the screenplay, he has no other name than his character's name, the thin kid. And so I think through conflating art and life, Tremblay's novel is suggesting that our demand for fictional violence may inadvertently contribute to the production of the real thing. And if it does, do we bear some responsibility in that? So more concretely, when we watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, are we complicit in the abuse of Marilyn Burns? Is our pleasure heightened by the knowledge that her pain is real? In other words, are we monsters? So Tremblay uses recognized postmodern tactics to force a confrontation between you, the reader of horror, and your consumer habits. And depending on what your habits are, do you enjoy Cannibal Holocaust, Faces of Death, that kind of thing, that confrontation may be scary. But for me, the novel's biggest source of chills comes from, what is by now the most traditional postmodern trick in the book, the unreliable narrator. The narrator of Horror Movie hates liars, but he admits that he is a liar. He openly states that his memory of events may have no relationship to what actually went down, and he'll sometimes provide several stories, several explanations for a single outcome, so you can take your pick of the one you like. All of this is to foreground the blatant fictionality of his memoir, and memoir is a genre that we associate with confessional deep truths. He draws our attention to the artistic choices that he makes in a certain situation. He might say, approach it through the lens of drama, or will I approach it through the lens of horror, or some other convention. And it's just clear that through him, we have no access to what's really happening. And I still find the disappearance of an agreed upon reality to be unsettling. When you couple all of this with his unnerving affect, I think you have the ingredients of great horror. The narrator moves between being a passive introvert and a really bold, ball-breaking power player. He's impossible to pin down. He has a definite edge that is sometimes sheathed and sometimes exposed. And so when he's not being, pitiable and pathetic, he's really menacing. So if there were less of the screenplay and more of his audiobook, I think I would have really enjoyed Horror Movie much more than I did. Overall, I think there might be some disagreement amongst the three of us about this book. We all love Paul Tremblay. I, in particular, love the Pallbearers Club. I think it's a great novel. And I did like horror novel. I think it's got some really interesting ideas, and parts of it, I found really entertaining and scary, but there were other parts to me that just didn't work. We're all different. We all like different things. But thank you so much for joining us. If you like the channel, please subscribe. It would mean a lot, and we'll see you next time. Take care.